Category 4, this is existing data. Any of you do research on biospecimens? Anybody? No? All right, a fair amount of this has to do with biospecimens, so I can skip over that fairly quickly if nobody's actively doing it. But basically, that's what this is. They look at biospecimens as personally identifiable data. And the reason is because it's got DNA. And so they say regardless of whether or not there's an identifier as part of this tissue sample or this microscope slide, even if there's no name, even if there's no medical record number, just a slide, it's still personally identifiable because it's got DNA. And so they're going to treat it all that way.
Quick question. Is the presence of DNA the necessary criteria for whether it falls under this? So
that's the presumption behind this.
So things like medical images don't fall under this because they don't have DNA.
Right. Right. As long as they're otherwise de-identified. Right. All right. Proposal. Clarify the definition of existing, collected for purposes other than the proposed research. It does not mean that all the data or biospecimens exist at the time the study began. In a clinical context, the way that this typically comes up is you've got a researcher who wants to do research on people who have certain medical conditions. And either they want a tissue sample or they want the results of some kind of an intervention, or the results of some kind of a diagnostic test to do their research on. And they want to collect this data set, and then they're going to do their analysis of the whole set, right? Currently, that wouldn't qualify as exempt unless the complete data set already existed at the time you started your research. It has to be pre-existing data that was collected for non-research purposes, for therapeutic purposes. The proposed change is it doesn't have to be pre-existing. It can be ongoing. All you got to do is identify the source. And if you've got something to start with, then as they get more information, as they enroll more patients, you can use that data as well because the research isn't interfering with the clinical context of collection. Does that make sense? Okay. Remove the limitation so that retained identifiers would be allowed unless there are plans to return the research results. This is an interesting thing. You enroll people in a clinical trial of some sort, or a survey, or anything. And as long as you don't plan to give the results of that particular study back to the people who were in the study, it can be an excused project. If you plan to give the results back to the people who participated in it, then it needs IRB review because we know that sometimes giving clinical information back to research participants without a context, without an interpreter, without somebody who's pretty skilled at explaining what these numbers mean, could cause harm to the people who participated. They might misunderstand it. Okay? So as long as you're not planning to give the results back, no worries. So, research involving the collection or study of existing data, documents, records, pathological specimens, or diagnostic specimens. Even if they collect identifiers. Even if they collect identifiers. Excused. Not reviewed by anybody else. Result, the research use of identifiable as well as de-identified data and specimens that were obtained for purposes other than research would be in the excused category. As long as somebody collected it for a non-research purpose, you can go do research on it. As long as you can get ethical access to that data set, you're good to go. And nobody needs to know what kind of research you're doing. Researchers would register with an institutional office, but they say it doesn't have to be the IRB. Maybe it should be Julie Guevara's. Maybe it should be Donna Marcus in General Counsel Office under compliance. You just register with the university and then you file these excused research projects with that office. And at some point they might review some of them at the time they come in, which is not expected to be common, and then you audit them, a small number of them, after the fact at some point. Okay, and that's all you got to do. Consent for exempt research is sometimes obtained, like verbal consent when you do an educational survey or a study in your classrooms. But no consent is required for research using a biospecimen if the researcher doesn't possess information that would allow him to identify that person. Okay? So you don't need consent on biospecimen research unless you've got identifiers held by the researcher. Now they can go in and look at it. They can look at a medical record. Right now, if you're going to go do an exempt study on medical records, somebody has to de-identify that record. Usually somebody in the medical records office or the clinician office or somebody like that. No longer required. You can go in, you can see their names, you can collect their data. You're only interested in the data. You're not interested in whose data it is. And as long as you don't write down their name, you can still see their name. Just don't record it in your research. Okay? Next. No change to the oral consent with the understanding that at oral consent, broad use of the data collected was part of the oral consent. What this means is, and this goes well beyond research, they want to now propose a requirement that any clinician collecting biospecimens or medical information at any time for any purpose get consent at the time it's collected for the potential use of this data in future research, and give people an option. And if they say, yes, you can use my data in future research, then you're good to go. All of those data sets are then eligible for research. You simply require that anytime anybody gets information from you, you be given the opportunity to consent for its use in research. Pre-existing biospecimens, written consent is required regardless of why they were collected, research or non-research purpose, or the identifiability of the biospecimen. Not only do they have to ask you the question, you have to sign a form. And then somebody has to track that form, and somebody has to match that form of consent with whatever data they collected. And that has to be held in perpetuity. So you always have to be able to track back that you said, yes, I had 100% consent from everybody who was involved in my research, even though none of them knew they were. But they gave this broad consent when that data was originally collected.
What if the collecting agency or party has no intention of moving the specimens on to research?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. This proposal is to say anytime you collect data or specimens from a living human being in the United States, got to get written consent. Regardless of why they were collected. All right. Implication of the proposal. Existing biospecimens, consent's required for the use of all biospecimens. Of course, it's required for everything. Eliminate the biospecimen research currently allowed without consent. Next slide. We'll go through these pretty quickly because it's all biospecimen stuff. Pre-existing data. Written, if it was collected for non-research purposes, written consent is only required if the data is identifiable. If it was collected for research purposes, then written consent is required regardless of identifiability. And that's actually more restrictive than the current rule, which says if it was originally collected for research purposes, then its reuse for other research is bound by the conditions of the consent that you got when you originally collected it. And so if you asked for it then, you better have gotten a signature.